Newfoundlanders and Labradorians served on land, at sea, and in the air during the First World War. Some defended the home front. Many more fought on the front lines at places like France and Gallipoli. More than 6,000 men joined the Newfoundland Regiment. Another 2,000 served with the Newfoundland Royal Naval Reserve. But there were other forces too, like the Newfoundland Forestry Corps. It was a non-combatant military unit that formed in April 1917. Instead of fighting on the front lines, its loggers and sawmill workers served in the United Kingdom's forests. It was their job to supply Britain and other Allied forces with the huge quantities of lumber they needed for the war effort. The demand for lumber skyrocketed during the First World War. Armies needed it to build dugout shelters, to line muddy trench floors, and to provide stakes for the thousands of kilometers of barbed wire that stretched across the front lines. New railroads had to be built to transport soldiers and equipment across the Western Front. And the munitions industry depended on a steady supply of wood to serve as frames in its mines, so it could gather the iron ore it needed to manufacture weapons and ammunition. But just as Britain's need for timber rose, its supply was almost cut off. The United Kingdom imported much of its lumber from Canada. During the First World War, German U-boats disrupted the maritime trade routes that linked North America with Europe. By 1916, the British government was facing a crisis. It couldn't import enough lumber, so it decided to harvest local forests. The only problem was that there weren't enough loggers and sawmill workers in Britain to do the job, so the government decided to ask Canada if it could provide a battalion of lumbermen. The response was enthusiastic. Within 6 weeks of the request, 1,600 volunteers had come forward. The first 400 men arrived at England on April 12th. Many more followed. Before long, Newfoundland also decided to help. In March 1917, Newfoundland Prime Minister Sir Edward Morris was on a state visit to Britain. He suggested that the Dominion create a 500-man forestry corps. London agreed. A call for recruits went out on April 4th, 1917. Because the Forestry Corps was a non-combatant unit, enlistment requirements were much more relaxed than for the armed forces. In the end, recruiters accepted 500 volunteers into the Newfoundland Forestry Corps. They rejected another 278 on medical grounds. Forestry Corps volunteers covered a wide demographic. They included teenagers who were too young to join the armed forces and men who were too old to fight overseas. Recruiters also accepted men of military age who had tried to join the regiment or navy but were rejected on medical grounds. A few volunteers had served overseas, but they were wounded so badly that they were sent home. That happened to Lieutenant Hector Ross of the Newfoundland Regiment. He was fighting in Gallipoli when an enemy shell hit his left arm and wounded him so badly that he had to spend 6 months in hospital. Ross could not return to the front lines, but he still wanted to serve overseas, so he joined the Forestry Corps in 1917 and became its adjutant captain. The first 99 recruits left Newfoundland aboard the SS Florizel on May 19, 1917. The men were ordered to the hillside forest of Craigvennian, located on the Duke of Athol's estate at Dunkeld in central Scotland. The Forestry Corps established one camp near the bottom of the hill for sawmill workers and a second camp higher up the hill for loggers. They chopped down trees that were 50 feet and taller. Moving these giant logs down the steep hillside to the mill presented an early challenge. So the Newfoundlanders built a 900-meter-long chute that could quickly slide the logs from the top of the hill to a pond at the bottom. From there, they were floated to the sawmill. Forester J.A. Barrett wrote about camp life in the letters he sent to the Western Star newspaper in Newfoundland. He described the friendly relationship that existed between the local Scots and the Newfoundland lumbermen.
A great many visitors continue to come here every week. They find our work very interesting, especially the operations at the mills and the running of logs down the mountain chute. It is also new to them that they give such descriptive accounts of it to their friends, and then they want to see the novel sights about camp. Up to date, there have been sufficient trees felled to make nearly 3 million feet of lumber.
By early 1918, the Newfoundlanders had cleared 1,200 acres of timberland. They were transferred to the Scottish village of Kenmore, which lay about 40 kilometers to the east. They set up camp in an 800-acre forest that covered Drummond Hill. They continued to work in the area until the war ended. In January 1919, the Newfoundland Forestry Corps finally began to close down its operations and to send its volunteers home. Today, a statue of a Newfoundland forester is part of the National War Memorial in downtown St. John's. The memorial was unveiled in 1924 to honor all people from Newfoundland and Labrador who served in the war. Next to the forester stands a fisherman. He represents the people who served in the Merchant Navy. The Mercantile Marines were another group of non-combatants in the First World War. They worked on non-military vessels that carried passengers and cargo to Allied and neutral ports. More than 500 Newfoundlanders and Labradorians are known to have served in the Merchant Marine. Many worked in the North Atlantic, where German U-boats became a growing problem as the war progressed. On October 8, 1916, a U-boat torpedoed and sank the SS Stefano off the coast of Massachusetts. The Stefano was a Newfoundland steamer that had been carrying passengers from St. John's to New York. No one died in the attack, and American destroyers rescued everyone on board. But sometimes the Germans took the sailors prisoner. On June 28, 1918, a U-boat captured the Newfoundland schooner Dictator. Its 6 crew members became prisoners of war. 2 of the men died in captivity. The other 4 survived. They returned to Newfoundland in January 1919. At least 115 mercantile Marines from Newfoundland and Labrador are known to have died in the First World War. Their names are listed on memorials at Beaumont Hamel in France and at Bowring Park in St. John's. Newfoundlanders and Labradorians also joined other Allied forces during the war. More than 3,000 served with the Canadian Expeditionary Force, or the CEF for short. They were dispersed in many different battalions and units, so it is difficult to track their stories. The CEF's volunteers fought at many major battles during the First World War. They were at Ypres in 1915, at the Somme in 1916, and at Vimy Ridge and Passchendaele in 1917. Many of the Newfoundlanders and Labradorians who joined the CEF were living in Canada when the war broke out. That was the case with John Bernard Croak. He died while capturing an enemy garrison at the Battle of Amiens on August 8, 1918. His acts of bravery that day earned him the Victoria Cross. The London Gazette described Croak's actions.
Having become separated from his section, he encountered a machine gun nest, which he bombed and silenced, taking the gun and crew prisoners. Shortly afterward, he was severely wounded, but refused to desist. Having rejoined his platoon, a very strong point, containing several machine guns, was encountered. Private Croak, however, seeing an opportunity, dashed forward alone, and was almost immediately followed by the remainder of the platoon in a brilliant charge. He was the first to arrive at the trench line, into which he led his men, capturing 3 machine guns and bayoneting or capturing the entire garrison. The perseverance and valor of this gallant soldier, who was again severely wounded and died of his wounds, were an inspiring example to all.
Some Newfoundlanders and Labradorians served in the sky. At least 21 people from the Dominion were aviators during the war. One of them was Lieutenant Leonard Edens. He transferred from the Newfoundland Regiment to the Royal Flying Corps. Edens described his first air fight in a letter home, which the Evening Telegram published on September 15, 1917.
It is 2 days now since I had my baptism of fire, and I tell you it's all it's cracked up to be and more. You go sailing securely through the air, and then there's a woof woof right under your tail. Then you proceed to make yourself scarce. That is your introduction to the anti-aircraft gun, or Archie as we call him. He is no friend of ours at all. Last night I had my first fight. We were on patrol well over the lines when we saw a crowd of Huns and attacked them. It was some show. About 20 machines all mixed up and firing their guns. It lasted about 20 minutes, and then we went home as the Huns all buzzed off. The result was sort of indecisive. We saw 3 Huns go down, but do not know whether they were done in. One of our fellows is missing.
Edens also went missing in an air fight on March 18, 1918. Officials later learned that he died in enemy hands. Today, people continue to pay tribute to the sacrifices that servicemen like Edens, Croak, and the thousands of other Newfoundlanders and Labradorians made during the First World War. Whether they volunteered in one of Newfoundland's units or in other Allied forces, their service is honored by the dozens of memorials that were established after the war. Memorials that thousands of people continue to visit every year.